Tales from Longpuddle. The Wagon to Longpuddle. It is a Saturday afternoon in autumn in the high street of a well-known town. A large carrier's wagon stands outside the town hall, and the horses wait quietly, eating from their nosebags. On the side of the wagon, in large yellow letters, are the words, "Parson, carrier to Longpuddle." It is now 3:30 by the clock on the town hall, and the wagon will leave at 4. Slowly, people begin to arrive and take their seats. First, 2 women climb up, and then a third, who is the postmistress at Longpuddle. At 5 minutes to 4, more people arrive. There is Mr. Prophet, the schoolteacher, and Christopher Twink, the builder, with his old father. Then come a farmer and his wife, and last of all, Mr. Flaxton, the church clerk. By now Parson, the carrier, is getting the horses ready, and soon he climbs up to the driving seat. "Is everybody here?" he asks the passengers. The people who are not there do not reply, of course, and a minute or 2 later the wagon begins to move along the high street. When it comes to the bridge over the river at the bottom end of the town, the postmistress suddenly calls out to the carrier. "Mr. Parson," she says, "there's a man calling you, over there by the corner. I think he wants you to stop for him." Parson stops the wagon and waits while the man comes towards them. "Now who's that then?" he says. "That's not a Longpuddle man." "I've never seen him before," says the schoolteacher. Then the stranger arrives. "Can you take another passenger for Longpuddle?" he asks. "We can take one more," says the carrier. "Where are you from, sir? You're not from round here, are you?" "I am," says the stranger. "I was born at Longpuddle, and my father and grandfather before me." The postmistress is watching him with interest. "Oh," she says suddenly, "I know who you are. You're John Lackland's son. He who went to America 30 years ago with his wife and family." "That's right," says the stranger, smiling. "John Lackland was my father, and now I've come home to have a look at the old village and find some old friends. Are the same families still living there?" "Many of them are," says the church clerk. "Which names do you remember?" "There was a boy called Tony Kytes, I remember." "Oh, yes," says the clerk. "Tony Kytes is a married man now. Lives over at Mellstock, I think." "And he nearly got married to 3 women, laughs the carrier. "There's a good story about Tony and all his young women." "Tell me about it," says John Lackland's son. And this is the carrier's story. Tony Kytes finds a wife. I shall never forget Tony's face. It was a little round face with bright black eyes. He never smiled very much, but he was a great favourite with the women. And he liked them, oh yes. One week you saw him walking along with one girl, the next week you saw him with another girl. But in the end, he decided that Millie Richards was the girl for him. She was a nice, sweet little thing, and people soon said they were engaged to be married. One Saturday, Tony went to market to do some business for his father, and he drove the wagon home in the afternoon. When he got to the hill just outside the town, he he saw Unity Sallet by the side of the road. He knew Unity very well. Once he nearly asked her to marry him, but then he got together with Milly. When Tony came up to her in the wagon, Unity said, "My dear Tony, can I ride home with you?" "Of course you can, my love," said Tony. "I couldn't say no to you, could I?" So Unity smiled, jumped up into the wagon, and Tony drove on up the hill. "Tony," she said in a soft little voice, "why did you leave me for that other girl? How is she better than I am? I'll be a fine wife and a loving one too. And you've known me for a long time, haven't you, Tony?" "Yes, I have," said Tony. "Yes, that's very true." "And can you say I'm not pretty, Tony?" He looked at her for a long while. "I really can't," said he. "No, I think you're the prettiest girl in the world." "So I'm prettier than she is, am I?" Luckily, before Tony could answer, he saw a girl's hat over the hedge round a turning in the road. He knew the hat very well. It was Milly's hat. "Unity," said Tony quickly, "here's Milly coming now. I'll be in terrible trouble if she sees you with me. Now, dearest Unity, we don't want any fighting or anything, do we? So will you lie down in the back of the wagon, under the tarpaulin, just until Milly has passed, and I'll think about what you said, and perhaps I'll put a loving question to you and not Milly. Nothing is decided yet between her and me, you know." So Unity lay down under the tarpaulin in the back of the wagon, and Tony drove on to meet Milly. "My dear Tony," Milly said crossly when he came near, "how late you are." "Late?" said Tony. "Were you waiting for me?" "Of course I was," said Milly. "You asked me to meet you, to ride home with you. Don't you remember?" "Oh dear," said Tony. Yes, I did. I remember now. Oh dear, jump in then, Milly dear." So Milly climbed into the wagon and Tony drove on. They talked about this and that and looked at the trees and the birds. Then they came to a house by the road, and looking out of an upstairs window was Hannah Jolliver. Now, Hannah was a tall, good-looking girl with long red hair, and Tony was in love with her for a long time, before Milly and before Unity. "My dear old Milly," he said in a whisper, because he didn't want Unity to hear, "there's a young woman looking out of that window who wanted to marry me. I'm afraid she's going to be angry because she's found out that I'm going to marry you, and you're a prettier girl than she is. So, Milly, will you help me?" "Of course, dearest Tony," said Milly. "Then will you hide under the empty sacks just here in the front of the wagon, behind the seat? She hasn't seen us yet, and then there won't be any angry words." "Well, all right, if it helps you, Tony," said Milly. She didn't really want to, but she got down behind the seat and hid under the sacks. So there was Milly hiding in the front of the wagon, and Unity hiding in the back. Tony drove on past the house, which was Hannah's uncle's house, and Hannah looked down from the window and called out to him, "Aren't you going to ask me to ride home with you?" "Oh, yes, of course," said Tony, who didn't know what to say. "But aren't you staying at your uncle's?" "No, I'm not," said Hannah. "Can't you see I've got my hat and coat on? How can you be so stupid, Tony?" Yes, then you must ride home with me, of course," said Tony, who was beginning to feel hot and uncomfortable. So he stopped the wagon while Hannah ran downstairs and got in beside him. Tony drove on again, and then Hannah looked at him out of the corner of her eye. "This is nice, isn't it, Tony?" she said. "I like riding with you." Tony looked back into her eyes. "And I like riding with you," he said after a while. Then he looked into her eyes again, a good, long, slow look. He began to like her more and more, and then he couldn't remember why he ever wanted to marry Milly or Unity. He moved nearer to Hannah on the seat, and they talked in soft little whispers. And after a time, Tony said, "Ah, my sweet Hannah," and took hold of her hand. "I'm sorry that you're going to marry Milly," Hannah said, "because I do like you very much, Tony dear." Tony gave a quick look behind him. "I haven't asked her the question yet," he whispered, "and I'm not sure I will. I'm thinking about asking you." "Ooh! Leave Milly and marry me!" cried Hannah loudly. "Oh, how wonderful!" At this there was a sudden little angry scream from behind the seat, and the tarpaulin at the back moved. Hannah looked round. "Something's there, Tony. There's an animal in the back of the wagon." "No, no," said Tony. "It's just empty sacks, and it's the wheels that make that little screaming sound." But he knew that he was in trouble, and he didn't know what to do next. Then the wagon came round a corner in the road, and Tony saw his father in a field. His father held up his hand, and Tony saw his escape. "Oh, Hannah," he said, "can you hold the horse for a minute while I go and find out what father wants?" Hannah agreed, and Tony hurried into the field. "What are you playing at, Tony?" said old Mr. Kytes. "What do you mean, father?" "Well, if you're going to marry Milly Richards, do it, but don't go driving around the country with Jolliver's daughter. People will talk. You mustn't do it, boy." "Milly's there too, father." "Milly? Where?" "Under the sacks. Yes, and Unity Sallet is in there too, father, at the other end, under the tarpaulin. All three of them are in that wagon, and I don't know what to do. Which one shall I marry, father?" "Which one of them did not ask to ride with you?" "That was Milly, because I asked her." "Then marry Milly. She's the best. Hey, look." Tony looked round and saw his wagon moving. He began to run across the field as fast as he could. What was happening in the wagon? Milly, under the sacks, was the one who screamed. She began to move about, and then saw another woman's foot. So she moved along under the tarpaulin until she found Unity. "And what are you doing here?" she asked angrily. "I can ask you the same question," said Unity. "I'm engaged to be married to him, and I can—" "Oh, no, you're not," said Unity. "He's going to have Hannah, not you. He said it just now. We heard him." When Hannah heard voices under the tarpaulin, she forgot the horse and turned round. The horse decided to go home and moved off much too quickly. The wheels of the wagon went up on the side of the field. The wagon turned over, and all three girls fell out into the road. The horse looked round and stood still. Nobody was hurt, but when Tony ran up, the 3 girls were all shouting and crying and screaming. "Oh, don't be angry, my dears, please don't," said Tony. They did not stop crying and screaming, so he spoke more loudly. "I must do what's right," he said. "I've asked Hannah to marry me, and she's agreed." "Oh, no, I haven't," said Hannah, really angry now. "You must think I'm soft in the head. I'm not marrying a man who keeps girls in the back of his wagon." Tony looked surprised. "So you won't marry me, Hannah?" he said. "Never," said Hannah, and she walked away. Perhaps she did still want him, but she didn't want to say so in front of the other girls. Tony didn't know what to say next. Milly was crying her eyes out, and Tony's father thought that she was the best wife for him. But you never do what your father tells you to, do you? So Tony turned to Unity. "Well, will you marry me, Unity dear?" he said. "Marry something that Hannah Jolliver doesn't want? Not I," said Unity, and she walked away too. So then it was just Milly and Tony. Milly was still crying, and Tony stood there and looked at her. "Well, here we are," he said at last, "just the 2 of us. We'll get married then, shall we, Milly?" "If you like, Tony. You didn't really mean what you said to them?" "Not a word of it," said Tony. And then he kissed her, put the wagon back on the road, and they drove home. They went to see the parson the very next Sunday, and were married 2 Sundays later. At the end of his story, the carrier turns to the postmistress. "They had a fine wedding, Mrs. Weedle, didn't they? You were there, weren't you?" "Oh, yes," says the postmistress. "Best wedding party for years, and I've been to a lot of them. We've had some strange weddings too. Do you remember Andrew Satchel and Jane Valens a few years ago? But they got married in a different village," says the church clerk quickly. "Not in Longpuddle church." The carrier laughs. "It's all right, Mr. Flaxton. We know it wasn't you. Go on, Mrs. Weedle. Tell our visitor about Andrew and Jane." "Yes, I remember the Satchel family," says John Lackland's son. "I'd like to hear that story." And this is the postmistress's story. Andrew, Jane, the parson, and the fox. It all happened because Andrew Satchel liked his drink too much. Jane Valens, his bride, was some years older than him and was in a great hurry to get married. Andrew agreed to marry her because of the baby, but he didn't really want to get married, and Jane, poor thing, was afraid of losing him. She was very anxious to get him to church as soon as possible. So she was very happy early on a fine November morning when she and Andrew walked to the church just outside her village. Andrew's brother and sister went with them to be their witnesses. After the wedding, Andrew and Jane planned to go down to Port Bredy and spend the day there as a little holiday. When Andrew left Longpuddle that morning to walk to his bride's village, people said that he was walking all over the road, first one side, then the other. The night before, you see, he was at his neighbour's house for a party to welcome a new baby. It was a good party, and Andrew had no sleep and a lot of strong drink. He got to the church with Jane. They walked inside, and the parson looked at Andrew very hard. "What's this? You're drunk, my man, and so early in the morning too. That's disgraceful." "Well, that's true, sir," said Andrew, "but I can stand and I can walk. Better than a lot of people. You couldn't stand and walk after a party at Tom Forrest's house, could you, Parson? No, you couldn't." This answer didn't please Parson Billy Toogood a bit. He was strong on church business inside the church, but he was very different outside the church, I can tell you. "I cannot marry you when you are drunk, and I will not," he said. "Go home and get sober." Then the bride began to cry. "Oh, Parson, please marry us, please." "No, I won't," said Mr. Toogood. "I won't marry you to a man who is drunk. It's not right. I'm sorry for you, young woman, because I can see that you need to get married, but you must go home. How could you bring him here drunk like this?" "But if he doesn't come drunk, he won't come at all, sir," said Jane, still crying hard. But Parson Toogood still said no. "Well, sir," said Jane, "please, will you go home and leave us here for 2 hours? When you come back, Andrew will be sober. But I want to stay here, because if Andrew goes out of this church unmarried, wild horses won't get him back here again." "Very well," said Parson Toogood. "I'll give you 2 hours and then I'll come back." Andrew's brother and sister didn't want to wait all that time, so the church clerk sent them home. "We'll find some other people to be witnesses," he said. Then the bride whispered in the parson's ear, "Please, sir, will you lock the door and not tell anyone we are here? And perhaps it will be better if you put us in the church tower. If we stay here in the church, people can look in the windows and see us and talk about it, and perhaps Andrew will try to get out and leave me." "All right," said the parson. "We'll lock you in." Then he and the church clerk went home, the parson into his house and the clerk into the garden. The clerk worked for the parson, you see, in the garden, taking care of his horses and that kind of thing. And both of them, parson and clerk, dearly loved following the hunt. Well, on that day the hunt was meeting near the parson's village, and soon both the parson and the clerk could hear the noise of the horses and the dogs and everything. The clerk hurried into the house. "Sir," he said, "the hunt's here, and your horses need a run very badly, sir. They haven't been out for days." "You're right," said Parson Toogood. "Yes, the horses must go out. Go and get them ready. We'll take them out just for an hour and then come back." So the clerk got the horses ready, and he and the parson rode off to find the hunt. When they got there, the parson found a lot of friends, and soon they were all talking and laughing together. Then the dogs found a fox, and away they all went, the huntsmen in their red coats, the squire from the big house with his friends, the farmers and their sons, and the parson and the clerk. He was a great hunting man, was Parson Toogood. He forgot all about the unmarried man and woman locked in his church tower, and so did the clerk. Across the fields they rode, over the hedges, through the rivers, in and out of woods, up and down the hills. It was a fine, exciting run that day, and the parson and the clerk enjoyed themselves very much. At one time the fox turned back and ran right under the nose of Parson Toogood's horse. "Halloo, halloo!" shouted the parson. "There he goes!" And away they all went again. At last, late in the day, the hunt came to an end. The parson and the clerk were a long way from home, and their horses were tired. They rode home very slowly. "Oh dear, my back does hurt," said Parson Toogood. "I can't keep my eyes open," said the clerk. "I'm so tired." It was dark when they got home. They made the horses comfortable, ate something, and fell into bed themselves. The next morning, when Parson Toogood was having breakfast, the clerk came running in through the door. "Oh, sir," he cried, "those two in the church tower! We forgot all about them. They'll still be there." Parson Toogood jumped up from his chair. "Oh dear," he said. "Oh dear, this is disgraceful." "It is, sir, very, and that poor woman." "Don't say it, clerk, if she's had the baby and no doctor or nurse with her. Come on." So they both ran round to the church, looked up at the tower, and saw a little white face looking down at them. It was the bride. "They're still there," said the parson. He turned his face away. Oh dear, what am I going to say to them? Is she all right, Clark? Can you see?" "I don't know, sir. I can't see lower than her neck." "Well, how does her face look?" "White, sir, very, very white." "Well, we must go in and see them. Oh dear, and my back still hurts from that ride yesterday." They went into the church and unlocked the tower door, and at once poor Jane and Andrew jumped out like hungry cats from a cupboard. Andrew was very sober now, and his bride was white in the face, but all right in other ways. "Thank God for that," said Parson Toogood. "But why didn't you try to escape? Why didn't you shout from the top of the tower to get help?" "She didn't want me to," said Andrew. Jane began to cry again. "It was the disgrace of it," she said. "We thought people would talk about it and laugh at us all our lives. So we waited and waited and waited, but you never came back, Parson." "Yes, I'm sorry about that," said Parson Toogood. "Very sorry, but now let's get on with the wedding." "I'd like something to eat first," said Andrew. "Just a piece of bread. I'm so hungry I could eat a horse." "Oh, let's get married first," said the bride anxiously. "While the parson's still here, it won't take a minute." "Oh, all right," said Andrew. The clerk was one witness, and he called in a second witness, telling him not to talk about it. Very soon Andrew and Jane were husband and wife. "Now," said Parson Toogood, "you two must come back to my house and eat a good meal." So they went back with the parson and ate nearly every bit of food in his house. They kept the secret for a while, but then the story got out, and everybody knew about their night in the church tower. Even Andrew and Jane laugh about it now. Andrew isn't much of a husband, it's true, but Jane got a ring on her finger and a name for her baby. The carrier laughs loudly at the end of the postmistress's story. "Did you know Andrew's uncle?" he asks John Lackland's son. "He played in the church band." "The church band," says Mr. Lackland. "Are they still playing their fiddles in the church every Sunday?" "No," says Mr. Prophet, the school teacher. "They haven't played for 20 years or more. There's an organ in the church now. The young man who plays it is very good, but most people liked the fiddles better." Yes, everybody in Longpuddle was sorry when the church band stopped playing. "But why did they stop?" says John Lackland's son, "if everybody liked them?" And this is what the school teacher tells him. The church band. It was on the Sunday after Christmas. That was the last time the band played in Longpuddle Church, but they didn't know it at the time, of course. They were a very good band, the best of all the villages around. There was Nicholas Puddingham, who played the first fiddle. There was Timothy Thomas and John Biles on the other fiddles, and Dan Hornhead and Robert Dowdle played the oboes. They didn't just play church music, they could play all kinds of dance music too. They often went out to play at dancing parties in people's homes or in the village inn. So one night they were in the squire's big house, playing nice Christmas songs and drinking tea with all the squire's fine friends. And the next night they were down at the Dog and Fox, playing noisy dance music for 20 dancers and drinking hot brandy and water. Well, that Christmas week was a busy time for them. They were out at dance parties every night and got very little sleep. Then came the Sunday after Christmas. It was cold that winter. Oh, my word, it was cold. And upstairs in the church gallery it was even colder. So when the band was playing on that Sunday morning, Nicholas Puddingham said to the others, "I can't feel my fingers, it's so cold. How can a man play the fiddle when he can't feel his fingers? This afternoon we'll have something to make us warm." So he brought a big jar of hot brandy and water to church in the afternoon. They put the jar inside Timothy Thomas's fiddle bag, which kept it nice and warm. And during that long afternoon in church, they all had a little glass now and then, so when the parson began his sermon, they were all feeling comfortable and warm. Unluckily for them, the sermon that day was a long one, and the parson went on and on and on. And every man in the band fell asleep, and they slept like babies all through the sermon. It was a very dark afternoon, and by the end of the sermon you couldn't see very much inside the church. When the parson finished, he called for the last piece of music. But the band did not start playing, and people began to turn round and look up at the gallery. Then Levi Limpet, a boy who sat in the gallery, whispered to Nicholas, "Begin, begin." "Hey, what?" said Nicholas, and nearly fell out of his chair. Then, because the church was dark and he was still half asleep, he thought that he was at a party. The night before, you see, the band was playing all night at a party at the Dog and Fox, and Nicholas thought he was still there. So he took his fiddle and immediately began to play The Laughing Sailor. That was the favourite dance tune in our village that winter. The rest of the band woke up suddenly, and hearing The Laughing Sailor, of course, they just followed Nicholas. And away they all went, fiddles and oboes, as loudly as they could. They played that dance tune until the church walls shook with the sound. Then Nicholas saw that nobody was moving. If people didn't know the dances, he often called out the moves to help them. And so he did that now. "Up to the top, change hands, then back down the other side," he shouted. "Then turn around once, twice, take hands and back to the top again. The boy Levi was very frightened. He ran down the gallery stairs and out of the church as fast as his little legs could carry him. The parson's hair stood on end when he heard that wicked dance tune in his church. He held up his hand and cried, "Stop, stop, 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 stop!" But the band didn't hear him because of the noise of the music. The parson went on calling, "Stop, stop!" and the band went on playing. Then people in the church began to stand up and talk. "What's happening? Why are they playing this wicked music? Is it the devil himself up there in the gallery?" And the squire, too, stood up. He was there with all his fine friends, and he was very angry. He went and stood in front of the gallery and shouted at the band, "Stop this wicked noise at once! Do you hear?" The squire had a good loud voice, and at last the band heard him and stopped playing. "Playing the devil's music in church, in God's house?" said the squire. "I have never heard anything so disgraceful in all my life. Never!" Oh, he was so angry. The parson came down and stood beside the squire. "Never," he said, "never." "The devil is in you men," said the squire. He was a wicked man himself, the squire was, but that day he was all on God's side, of course. "And you will never," the squire went on, "never, never play your fiddles in this church again. You have done a wicked thing today, and it must never happen again." By now the unhappy players knew that they were in church and not in the Dog and Fox. They put their fiddles and their oboes under their arms, and very quietly they went down the gallery stairs and out of the back door of the church. The parson was a kind man, and when he heard the true story later, he wasn't angry any more. He knew that Nicholas, Timothy, and the rest weren't wicked men. But the squire, that was a different matter. He was a hard man, and when he said no more fiddles, he meant no more fiddles. He sent away for an organ, and the next week there it was in the church. He found a young man from a good family to play it, and the old band played no more in Longpuddle Church. After this story, John Lackland's son asks about the young women of the village. "Or those who were young when I left all those years ago," he says. "They're all married now, I'm sure." "Let's see," says the carrier. "Do you remember Netty Sargent, sir?" "Netty Sargent? Yes, I do. When I left, she was living with her uncle, wasn't she?" "That's right. She was a bright young thing, Netty was. Nothing bad about her, you understand, just a little bit clever. She was very clever about the leasehold of her house, I remember." The carrier looks round at his passengers. "Who will tell Mr. Lackland that story, then?" "My wife knew Netty when they were girls," says the farmer, Mr. Paul. "She can tell you." Nancy Paul is a big, comfortable-looking woman. She laughs and says, "Oh, yes, I can tell you all about Netty Sargent." Netty Sargent and the House. Netty Sargent lived with her uncle in that lonely house just outside the grounds of the squire's big house. She was a tall young woman with black hair and dancing eyes, and she had a little laughing smile that sent all the young men wild. All the young men of that time were after her, but in the end she decided that Jasper Cliff was her favourite. He was good-looking, but he only ever thought about himself, not other people. But Netty wanted Jasper, and none of the others. Jasper liked Netty too, but he was more interested in her uncle's house. The house was built by Netty's great-great-grandfather and had a garden and a little field next to it. But it was a leasehold house, because the ground belonged to the squire. "And what happens," Jasper asked Netty one day, "when your uncle dies?" "The house, garden and field will go back to the squire," said Netty. "But if uncle pays a few pounds, he can renew the leasehold and put another name on it. Then the squire can't get the house back until that person dies." "And what is your uncle going to do?" asked Jasper. "Oh, he's going to renew the leasehold and put my name on it. He told me that months ago." Netty's uncle knew that it was important to renew the leasehold because the squire was very anxious to get the house back. The squire didn't like all those little leaseholds on his ground, and he wanted to pull the house down and make it all nice and tidy. Netty's uncle knew this very well, but he still didn't renew the leasehold. He didn't like Jasper Cliff, so perhaps he didn't like to think of Jasper marrying Netty and living in the house when he was dead. Every week Jasper asked Netty about the leasehold, and Netty asked her uncle, and her uncle said, "I'll go and see the squire's agent next week." But still nothing happened. At last old Mr. Sargent fell ill, and Jasper got tired of waiting. "Why doesn't your uncle do it?" he asked Netty. "I tell you, if you lose the house and ground, I won't marry you, and there's an end of it." Poor Netty hurried indoors to talk to her uncle. "Please do something, uncle," she said. "If I don't get the house, I won't get a husband." "And you must have Jasper, must you, my dear?" "Yes, uncle, I must." Old Sargent didn't want to make Netty unhappy, so he asked for a meeting with the squire's agent. The squire was very cross when he heard this. He was hoping that old Sargent would die and the leasehold would come to an end. But he had to agree to renew the leasehold if Sargent paid the money. So the squire's agent got the new papers ready for old Sargent to sign. By now Netty's uncle was really ill and couldn't leave the house. The agent agreed to visit him. "I'll come at 5 o'clock on Monday," he told Netty, "and Mr. Sargent can pay the money and sign the papers then." At 3 o'clock on that Monday, Netty brought her uncle a cup of tea. When she came in the room, her uncle gave a little cry and fell forward in his chair. Netty ran to him, but he could not speak or move, and in a few minutes she saw that his face and hands were cold and white. He was dead, stone cold dead. Netty was very unhappy. "Why didn't he live 2 more hours?" she thought. "Now I've lost everything, house, garden, field, and a home for myself and my lover. What am I going to do now?" Then, suddenly, she knew what she had to do. It was a dark December afternoon, which was very helpful for her. First, she locked the front door. Then she moved her uncle's table in front of the fire. Her uncle's body was still in his chair, which was a big old chair on wheels. So she pushed the chair, with her uncle in it, to the table, putting the chair with its back half turned to the window. On the table she put the large family Bible open in front of him and put his finger on the page. Then she opened his eyes a little and put his glasses on his nose. When it got dark, she lit a candle and put it on the table beside the Bible. Then she unlocked the door and sat down to wait. When she heard the agent's knock at 5 o'clock, she hurried to the door. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered. "Uncle's so ill tonight, I'm afraid he can't see you." The agent was not very pleased. "So I've come out all this way for nothing, have I?" "Oh, no, sir, I hope not," said Netty. "We can do the business about the leasehold, can't we?" "Of course not. He must pay the money and sign the household papers in front of me. I have to be a witness." Netty looked worried. "Uncle is so afraid of business things like this. His hands were shaking when I told him that you were coming today." "Poor old man. I'm sorry for him," said the agent. "But he must sign the papers, and I must be a witness." "Yes, I understand that, sir," said Netty. She thought for a minute. "You have to see him, but can you still be a witness, sir, if he doesn't see you?" "How do you mean, girl?" said the agent. "Come with me a minute," she said. She took him into the garden and round to the window. Inside, the agent could see at the other end of the room the back and side of the old man's head and his arm. He could see the glasses on his nose and the book and the candle on the table. "He's reading his Bible, sir," said Netty in her softest, sweetest voice. "Yes, I see that," said the agent. "But nobody ever sees him in church, do they?" "No, but he loves his Bible," said Netty. "I think he's sleeping a little at the moment, but that's not surprising in an old man who's so unwell. Now, sir, can you stand here at the window and watch him sign the papers? Then he won't see you, and he won't be worried and unhappy about it all. Can you do that for him, sir?" "Very well," said the agent. He took out a cigar, lit it, and began to smoke. "Have you got the money ready?" "Yes," said Netty. "I'll bring it out." She hurried inside and brought out the money. The agent counted it, then gave Netty the leasehold papers. "Uncle's hand is very shaky now," she said, "and he's so sleepy. I don't think he signs his name very well." "He doesn't have to have beautiful writing. He just has to sign," said the agent. "Can I hold his hand to help him?" "Yes, hold his hand, girl. That'll be all right." Netty went into the house, and the agent went on smoking his cigar outside the window. He saw Netty put the pen and the papers in front of her uncle and touch his arm and speak to him. She showed him where to write his name on the papers and put the pen in his hand. Then she stood behind him and held his hand, but the agent could still see a bit of his head, and he saw the old man's hand write his name on the papers. Then Netty came out and gave the papers to the agent, and the agent signed his name as witness. He gave her the paper signed by the squire and left. And the next morning Netty told the neighbours that her uncle was dead in his bed. So that's how Netty Sargent lost her house and field and got them back again with a husband. But Jasper was a mistake as a husband. After a few years, he started hitting Netty. Not very hard, but it made her angry. Then she told a neighbour about the leasehold business, and the story got around. By then the old squire was dead, and the squire's son got to hear the story. But Netty was a pretty young woman, and the squire's son never did anything about it. Soon the carrier's wagon came down the hill into Longpuddle, and everybody got out and went home. John Lackland's son went to find a room at the Dog and Fox. He stayed in Longpuddle for a few days, walking around, looking at things, and talking to people. Then he left, and no one saw him again. "Where did he go?" the schoolteacher asked Mrs. Weedle in the post office one day. "I don't know," said Mrs. Weedle. "He didn't tell anyone. He just went." Why did he come back to Longpuddle, do you think? He said he just wanted to see the place where he was a child. But perhaps he came back to get a wife and couldn't find one. Who knows?